This is Ashish Bedekar and welcome to my podcast, The ARB Show. I am thrilled to introduce today's guest, Dr. Alan. Dr. Alan is one of the leading decision scientists and theory of constraints, TOC experts in the world. As the CEO of Goldratt Research Labs, he has worked directly with Dr. Eli Goldratt. And I'm sure all of us know that Dr. Goldratt is renowned as international best-selling author, scientist, business leader, and creator of theory of constraint. Dr. Alan has helped to spearhead the research and development of new applications of TOC. He also contributes his time and experience to a number of non-profit organizations to apply the insight and benefits to public sector organizations, NGOs, and individuals. Welcome to the show, Dr. Alan. Do share about your life journey and your vision for TOC.
You're very welcome and thank you for the invitation.
Thanks, Dr. Alan. So, for the audience, it would be great if you could highlight, some easy way to understand the concept of TOC so that the audience can really understand the value which TOC concept brings to their life. It could be from a business perspective as well. And I'm sure it can also help in the personal life as well. But let's focus on the business aspect for this podcast. So it would be great for you to, share your simple explanation for TOC. Over to you, Doctor.
Sure, thank you. So I think the simplest way to understand theory of constraints is to look on the simple principle it's based. It's based on the simple principle that any organization, whether it is a for-profit organization or for purpose, small or large, has at least one constraint that is limiting it from achieving more of the goal of that organization. So a constraint is kind of like the weakest link in the chain. And that gives profound leverage, because if you're thinking about where should I focus to improve, I should focus on making the weakest link stronger. If I make that one stronger, the whole chain becomes stronger. In the same way that if I improve the constraint of the organization, wherever it is, I'm improving the whole organization. At the same time, if I'm improving a link that's not the weakest, if I make it stronger, it doesn't help. It just wastes resources. So that's the essence of theory of constraints. You could summarize it essentially in a single word, which is focus. Where should I focus to improve my organization? Find and focus on the weakest link or the constraint.
Great. And would it be correct to say that in terms of a visual concept, it is similar to, let's say, in a road network, you want to go from point A to point B, and most of the road, it's perfectly fine with, three-tiered infrastructure and super highways, etc. But within the road, right, there is a small bridge, and suddenly you have got a small road, right? The bigger highway kind of goes and goes and merges into a small road. So that's the kind of constraint, right? And that effectively defines the rate of traffic flow across from point to point.
Exactly. That's another way of thinking about theory of constraints. Rather than thinking of it as a chain with a weakest link, you think of it as a system where there's flow, like a traffic system, and there's a bottleneck. And that bottleneck determines the rate of flow, right? The system can't flow faster than what that bottleneck can take. So if you want to get more cars to go through, you'd have to widen the bridge, right? It doesn't matter if you widen all the other roads. All the other lanes could be 4 lanes, but if the bridge is only 2 lanes, that will dictate the flow. So it's a great analogy.
Excellent. So, Dr. Alan, I was reading somewhere that, typically when you talk of theory of constraints, there is a reference to 5 types of constraints. So it would be great if you could, highlight and enlighten the audience about what are those 5 types of constraints when it comes to TOC.
Sure. So as I mentioned, theory of constraints is really there to help us focus, to find the one thing at any moment to focus on. And it has 5 focusing steps. It says step number 0 essentially is to define the goal, right, of your organization, whether it's for profit or for purpose. If you don't have a clear goal, then guess what is the one thing, right? Is define a clear goal. Because the goal will determine the work that you're going to have to do, whether you provide products or services. It's going to determine the resources that you need, and it will also determine how much of every resource you need. And a resource that you don't have enough of is a constraint, and a constraint will limit your ability to achieve that goal. So as you mentioned, there are really 5 types of constraints, and you can think of it of working backwards from the customers that your goal is intended to serve, right? So imagine you have a goal of making $1 million or helping 1 million people. The first question is there enough customers that want your product or service? If you say no, you have a market constraint, right? And that is the one thing to focus on, how to get more customers to want to buy my product, pay more for it, buy more frequently. That's the first one, as a market constraint. Well, what if you have enough customers? Then the second thing that can be the constraint is, I have enough customers, but I don't have enough capacity to meet the demand. And that could be anywhere internal in my own organization. It could be production, it could be procurement, it could be sales. I just don't have enough capacity to meet the demand that's being placed on me. That's a capacity constraint number 2. The third one, going back further in your supply chain or value chain, is I have enough demand, enough capacity, but I don't have enough supply. There's some external resource that I need, raw materials, components, skills, etc., that is limiting my ability to meet all the demand. So that's the third type of constraint, is a supply constraint. Going back even further is I might have enough demand, capacity, and supply, but I don't have enough cash to afford all of those. And that's the fourth type of constraint, not having enough cash. And then the last one took us a long time to discover, to realize, is that even if you have all of those things, there's always a resource that I will never have enough of. A resource where the demand that's placed on it will always exceed its available capacity. And it's called management attention. And if you think about that, the number of things that are demanding your attention, and all the entrepreneurs and business owners and managers out there, the demand on their attention will always exceed their available attention. There's so many things you can help, right, to improve. What are the one things? And that's kind of the 5 constraints that you could have in a business, is the market, capacity, supply, cash, or management attention.
Right. And while you were saying, I was just reflecting back on a simple analogy, and please correct me if I've got it wrong. So I was thinking of, let's say there's a commercial vehicle, right? I'm an owner of a commercial vehicle, and I have an order, right? Or I have a kind of opportunity to carry goods from point A to point B, right? So which means if I have a commercial vehicle but no orders, that's the market constraint.
Yes.
The second could be, let's say I have the order, but my vehicle is not of the right size, right? It's a small vehicle, right, whereas the order is for a bigger payload.
Or I simply don't have enough vehicles. I was too successful with my marketing, and now I have too much demand.
Exactly, right? So that could be the constraint from a second constraint. The third constraint could be, I don't have necessary fuel for the journey, right? So which could be a resource or a cash kind of play. And
there's a shortage of drivers at the moment. I have the
exactly.
I have the truck, but I just can't get a driver at the moment.
Exactly. And then finally, it could be that, all of these constraints are happening in parallel or happen at one point of time. And I want to flag this to the owner of the trucking company, saying that, hey, this is a problem. You need to fix all these things, right? Because there's a huge opportunity,
Yes.
but we are not able to service it. And that could be the marketing management constraint. So is that way a correct way of understanding?
That's a very good analogy. Absolutely.
Excellent. So when we say about these 5 type of constraints, could you elaborate or could you do some interesting, use case or success stories from your practice, wherein you looked at a specific challenge, you kind of did the analysis, the diagnostic of what exactly is going wrong, and then you applied the theory of constraint to really have a great business outcome and a sustainable business outcome. And also, if you could highlight that, as human beings, right, we are conditioned to behave in a certain way, right? When there is a change, there's always a resistance to change. But when you go to the next level of performance, that becomes the next level of comfort, right? So maybe from a human angle, when you improve the processes and when you had a superlative outcome, how did the human behavior change? So it would be good for the audience to hear about from you as well.
Sure. So I mentioned that at the core, theory of constraints has these 5 focusing steps. So once you've defined your goal clearly, then step number 1 is identify the system constraints. And it's plural because it could be, as you mentioned, that at any point in time, there's more than one resource that I don't have enough of to meet the goal, right? So that's always step 1, is identify the system constraint. A very simple system has one constraint. A complex system could have more than one, and a chaotic system has interactive constraints. They're moving all the time. That's another story of how to manage that. Step number 2 says, once I've identified the constraint, I have to decide how to better exploit it and not waste it. So if you take a company with a market constraint, for example, the market share determines how well they are exploiting the current market, current products, current customers, right? So the opportunity for better exploitation is the market share that they don't have. So if they have 10% market share, there's 90% market share available there for them to exploit before they're thinking about what we call step 4 of the 5 focusing steps, which is elevate the constraint. Step 3 is subordinate everything to the decision about how to exploit. So if you identified how big that gap is and what makes up that gap, the condition, subordinate means go and change any policy or process or measurement or behavior that's in conflict with that decision, right? So that's kind of the core idea is identify the constraint, decide how to exploit it, get more out of what you already have, then subordinate, change anything that's required to better exploit it. If it's still not enough, then go and elevate. And then the last step is a warning. Very similar to what you talked about, which is if you have broken a constraint in one of the previous steps through better exploitation or elevation. Elevation simply means go and get more, right? So if it's a market constraint, it means go and add more products or go into new markets. If it's a capacity constraint, it means go and buy another machine versus exploiting it as making sure you don't waste its capacity, etc. Step 5 is a warning. It says if you've broken a constraint, do not let inertia cause a constraint. So don't get stuck. Go back to step 1. Find out where the new constraint is. And that essentially, to me, is the key function of leadership, is to constantly improve, right? That 5 focusing steps is a process of ongoing improvement. It ensures that we don't get stuck. And of course, as you mentioned, people not only resist change, but they're very scared of change because they are often blamed if things fail. So they're scared of the failure. And leadership have to provide that safe environment where you can constantly do experimentations. For me, theory of constraints is all about focusing on the constraint and getting fast feedback, doing small experiments, checking if it works. Is this helping us get more out of our constraint? Is it helping us get more of that constraint? And if not, how can we adjust? So that's just the overall framework, is that these 5 focusing steps are always applicable regardless of whether you have a market, capacity, supply, cash, or management attention constraint.
Got it. That's excellent. So, Dr. Alan, would it be possible to share some favorite case study of yours wherein you have kind of really transformed a specific client problem and really applied the TOC principle, and that you use it in your conversation? So, if you could share, that would be really enlightening. Yeah?
So there's 2 that I recently shared. One was when we worked with Microsoft, but not with their software division, with the division that actually produced physical products like keyboards, mouses, smartphones, the Surface Pro tablets, the HoloLenses, etc. And you can imagine they are competing against the Apples, the Samsungs, etc. And they didn't have a major market share, and they were trying to see what can they improve that will get retailers to carry more of their products. Because ultimately in a consumer goods supply chain, the ultimate constraint is the number of customers that want to buy your product, right? So how do you get more customers to want to buy your product? But as importantly, how do you get more retailers to want to carry your product? So we worked with Microsoft to design an end-to-end solution for them using theory of constraints that would essentially ensure that they could have very high levels of availability of their products at the retailers, but with very, very low levels of inventory. That is a massive advantage for a retailer, because the constraint for the retailer is shelf space and cash. So if you can offer them much higher inventory turns than your competitor, they would be much more willing to carry your product. Why? Because let's assume that you make 30%, whether I'm selling the Apple product or the Microsoft product. But with Apple, I'm getting 4 inventory turns a year. I'm making 30% 4 times a year. If I sell the Microsoft product and I can get 8 inventory turns, which one would I rather be carrying, right? So we knew that that was the advantage, and we ended up building a full supply chain digital twin for them to model their whole supply chain and to test whether the theory of constraint solution will really help them to increase availability at much lower levels of inventory. We used that to convince the retailers to carry more of their products. And in the same financial year that we started, they reduced their inventories by over $250 million, and at the same time increased sales by a few $100 million by avoiding shortages and surpluses. So that's one that's on the one extreme. The second case study I can share is one that I just did a recent post on. It's on the other spectrum, right? So this one is kind of a big high-tech company, one of the largest in the world. The other one is a company also large, but they supply staple food in South Africa. They have mills and bakeries. They supply flour and bread. Now, if you know anything about staple food, the margins are razor thin. You don't make much money. It's a very high volume business, but there's not much growth. You can't grow so fast because this company already had a high market share in the markets that they're expanding. And over a 6 to 7 year period that we worked with them implementing theory of constraints, they grew the value of their ordinary shares by 7,300%. That's 73 times, which is a number that might be, common for a Silicon Valley startup, but not for a staple food company. And essentially what we did there was we focused on identifying what are the most profitable mix of products to produce in their mills and bakeries. What were the most profitable mills and bakeries to produce the various products, and which customers was the most profitable? Because to profit maximize a system, you want to produce those products and services that gives you the highest margin per constrained resource. And that's what we focused on. We got incredible benefits from that.
Great, excellent, Dr. Alan. And I was also reflecting that, the beauty of POC or any system is the simplicity. And simplicity in terms of the construct, but the application is quite diverse, right? And that's the beauty of any system, because anything which is simple in terms of steps or simple or constraint, but can be applied across this thing has a great benefit. So that's thanks for sharing. It's really very inspiring. So we talked about POC, we talked about the types of constraint, we talked about a couple of case studies. But are there any exceptions wherein the POC concept has to either tweak or may not be applicable? Could you throw some light on that, please?
Sure. I mentioned the different types of organizations that you get. The simplest by far is one that has a single constraint. They just don't have enough demand. They have enough of everything else. Or they just don't have enough capacity. They have enough of everything else. A more complex type of company is one that has multiple constraints, but they are not interfering with each other. So it could be a company that owns a group of retail stores, and they own a group of distribution centers, but they are not linked to each other, right? Or they own a certain type of retail store and a different type of retail store, and they're not linked to each other. They will have their own constraints, but they are not interfering. That just means that if you want to grow the company, you now have to improve, better exploit, or elevate multiple constraints rather than just one. But the most complex company is kind of ones that have multiple constraints and they interact. So it's one that has set a goal that's so ambitious that they don't have enough market, they don't have enough capacity, they don't have enough supply, they don't have enough cash, and they definitely don't have enough management attention. So the question is, what do you do? Does fear of constraints apply even in that case? Yes, but in a different way. You don't start with identifying the constraint, because the answer will be it moves every day, right? Depending, it's just chaos. So what you do in that case is very counterintuitive. You actually have to lower your goal so that only one resource is the constraint. And you use that to reestablish flow. So you say, okay, I wanted to do $1 million of profit. What if I made that $500,000? Where will my constraint be? Well, then I will have enough demand, but I just don't have enough capacity. Okay, let me focus on the capacity. Once I've got that system flowing again, then I can say, okay, how do I now raise my target? Okay, now the market demand becomes a constraint. Let me move there. So that's the sort of the exception, is when the constraint is moving all the time. It means that you're in chaos. No use trying to even identify the constraint because it will move all the time. It's better to think about how to control the flow in the system by lowering the goal, pushing less into the system, making it flow, and then using that stable base to grow further from.
Right. So conceptual visual, it's akin to a bow and an arrow, right? You have to step back to move forward, right? Because many times if you have excessive ambition without the necessary framework or the necessary foundation, it's only going to create matters worse, right? Yes. I mean, I was just thinking, it is similar to a person who has an ambition or a dream that, yes, I want to climb a mountain summit, right? But just thinking or dreaming about it without having, being physically fit, or at least aiming to go to the base camp, etc., are prerequisites for you to even dream about that, right? So dreaming without having the necessary, infrastructure or the necessary requirements in place is delusion, not a dream. So that's very well put. So great. I think thanks, Dr. Alan. This really gives a great perspective on theory of constraint and getting started. Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in. And we'll also have some additional presentation in the show called Notes, which will have some social media links and bonus content that you should definitely check. Do subscribe, share, and like the podcast available on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, and other channels. Bye for now. Talk to you soon.